Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Meinen, Jesum, ich, nicht, which translates to I shall not leave my Jesus. Yesterday's chorale used the same text, but it was a different melody. This is the melody composed for this particular text. It's fairly straightforward. A couple of quirky chord progressions throughout that were made sort of motivic just because of the relationships between the chords. They're not really chord progressions we see all that often, but really not too much to write home about. So we're just going to hop right into the analysis with this one. We have 3 flats in the key signature, which is among one of the lesser common keys we see in Bach. We start on E flat major and we end on E flat major, so I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is E flat major. We have a passing tone in the bass, and then we have first inversion, E flat major, G, E flat, G, and B flat that briefly turns back into root position on the end of the beat. We then get A, C, E flat, and C, which is A flat major in root position. That's our 4 chord. Neighboring 7th here before we get, this is the first interesting chord progression. We have A, F, A flat, F, A flat, and C, which is F minor in first inversion. Now 4 and 2/6 are virtually the same chord, both in terms of function and pitch content. The only difference is E flat and F. So the fact that we're seeing them in succession like this is relatively uncommon. Usually we won't see 2 chords dedicated to their own specific beat. Maybe we'll see like a passing tone from E to F and then to like a 5 chord or a 7 chord or something like that. But yeah, we don't typically see chords that are a third apart like that next to one another in the harmonic rhythm. But regardless, it doesn't make a tremendous deal because I think really Bach is just sort of extending this idea of the predominant for 2 beats before our cadence. And the chord does do the same thing that we saw on the previous set of 4/8 notes, where the chord does briefly turn into root position here. We then get B flat, F, A flat, and D, which is B flat 7 in root position, the 5/7. Then we have a neighbor tone, actually 2 neighbor tones in the inner voices, B flat, E flat, G, and D. Kind of like a passing tonic 7 chord, but I don't really think it's super important to mark that. It's just something that serves as a buffer. There's going to be some situations here where I talk about buffer chords, separating chords that have similar functions. Like in this case, there actually is not a very involved buffer because we have 4 and 2, and because the chords are very similar to one another, typically Bach will inject a chord in between there. And you can see that even bare minimum, we have a neighbor tone in between the 2 chords that is serving sort of as, in my opinion, a buffer between the 2 similarly functioning chords. But that being said, on the next beat we have B flat, F, A flat, and D, which is just the same chord. We don't need to reanalyze. D is a chord tone, E flat is a little passing tone here, F is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And our first cadence is a perfect authentic cadence that ends on E flat, B flat, G, and E flat, tonic triad. Next phrase takes us to the key of B flat major. We also end in a perfect authentic cadence. Then we start off with a really similar idea as we do in the previous phrase. We have B flat, D, B flat, and F, which is our 5 chord, B flat major in root position. I think this sort of starts the point in which we could modulate to the key of B flat, knowing that we go to B flat later, even though we have the B natural here. But I think this A flat here is telling a little bit of a different story, so I don't think that B flat has just quite happened yet. B flat as a key, I mean, not as a chord. B flat as a chord is definitely happening here, but I think B flat as a key is going to have to wait until after we see more A naturals. So we have some passing tones in the bass, and then we have D, F, B flat, and F, again just taking our chord and inverting it. And here we have an interesting thing going on. We have B flat, we have D, we have A flat, and we have F. So the chord is going back into root position, but we're also adding the 7th there, and it's relatively uncommon for us to get 7 chords as a subdivided respelling like that. Usually we get them and they're not entirely intact, but here we have an entirely intact chord, so that's kind of interesting. Intact meaning that all of the chord tones are present, so 1, 3, 5, and 7, rather than just 1, 3, and 7, or just 1 and 7, any of those permutations that don't have the entire context but might be implying the chord. But afterwards we go to C minor, C, D, G, and E flat, D being a 9/8 suspension over this chord here. It's typically common to see 9/8 suspensions over tonic functioning triads, but here we see it functioning over like a deceptive tonic. We also have this little passing tone here in the bass that's reiterating the suspension. That's a common thing that Bach does when he changes the bass underneath us here. And we also get this secondary leading tone. After our secondary leading tone here, we get E flat, C, G, and E flat, which is just taking our chord, putting it in first inversion again. You see that this has become a bit of a motive, a harmonic sort of scheme for Bach to use. And the fact that we see A natural on the end of this beat makes me feel like this beat is significant in terms of the harmonic content. So I think in the key of B flat, this C minor, the C minor chord is now functioning as 2 rather than 6 in the key of E flat. And on the end of the beat we have F, and we have A natural as well, and in compliance with C and E flat, that gives us a 5/7 chord, fully spelled 2 on the end of the beat. It's kind of interesting to see 2 fully intact 5/7 chords on the ends of the weak beats of the measure. That's pretty cool. And then we're closing in on our cadence. We have another sort of quirky progression here, another deceptive progression in a sense. Just like how we had 5 going to 6 here, we're going to have 5 going to not 6 but 4. G, B flat, D, and D. Did I spell that right? G, B flat, and D, which is our 6th chord here. It actually does go to 6. Sorry, I had it in my notes as 4, 6, 5. I think I read this as E flat. Apologies there. But yeah, so we have another sort of pair of deceptive progressions here with 5/7 going to 6 rather than to 1. But we know typically when we're in such close proximity to the cadence here, we know that Bach will often use the 6th chord as a turnaround to take us to 2 and then 5, then to 1. So we have a passing tone here in the bass. We have a passing tone here in the alto as well, before we get E flat, B flat, G, and C. C minor 7 over E flat. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. C is a chord tone, E flat is a chord tone, D is a little passing tone here, very similar to the previous cadence we saw. So E flat being a chord tone that takes us to C. Sorry, what was I spelling the chord from the top here? We have F, B flat, F, and C. This is probably implying a 5 chord of some type. This B flat is a 4/3 suspension over the bass. Very common to see 4/3 suspensions over the bass, especially over dominant triads. So this G is just functioning as an enclosure, right? We're just surrounding A natural with B flat and G. That takes us to F, F, A, F, and C. So that's just the resolution of the suspension from the previous beat. Little delayed passing 7th here in the alto, and then we get our tonic triad, B flat, F, D, and B flat major in root position. Okay, next phrase is pretty interesting. We have a half cadence in the key of F minor. So B flat to F minor is a distant relationship, and typically speaking in Bach, it's relatively rare to see distant modulations. It's not unprecedented. We've seen Bach modulate between pretty distant keys in the past, but it is rare. And typically when there is a distant key modulation, or when there are 2 keys that are far away in relatively close proximity to one another in the chorale, there's going to be a key to smooth the progression between them. And in this case, I think B flat is functioning as our dominant to E flat, our tonic key, and we're then going to go to the key of F minor. So instead of going from 2 flats to 4 flats, we're going from 2 flats to 3 flats, reintroducing the A flat here to 4 flats. Okay, so starting things off, I think this B flat, like I said, is our 5 in the key of E flat. That takes us to E flat major, E flat, G, E flat, and B flat, which is 1. Passing tones in the bass, G, B flat, E flat, and B flat. It's 1 going to 1-6, just like we saw in our first phrase, and then the chord briefly turns back into root position on the end of the beat. We then have A flat, E flat, and C, which is our 4 chord, A flat major, passing 7th in the bass, passing tone in the tenor, before we get F, C, A flat, and C. A flat and C. So we're seeing another 4-2 progression here, just like we saw in the first phrase. So we're seeing kind of like an A, B, maybe A prime phrase here, at least in terms of the beginning of the phrase. And this 2 chord is going to be our gateway to the key of F minor. It's now our tonic. And even though we have E flat going to D natural here, we would typically expect D flat in this sort of descending configuration. Bach uses D as a pivot that turns it into melodic minor on the way up, and then we get ready for our half cadence. So F minor is now our tonic, passing 7th in the bass. We then have D natural, F, A flat, and B flat, which is B flat 7 over D. It's 4-6-5. Passing tones in the lower 3 voices, which give us E, G, G, and B flat. I'm going to use an arrow here. That is a 7 chord in root position, E diminished, and then that's going to take us to F minor, F, A flat, F, and A flat, 2 roots and 2/3, which is a spelling that is relatively common in Bach. I don't really comment too much on the spellings in comparison to how textbooks typically teach you about spellings. But yeah, this is a spelling that we see where we omit the 5th, but we double the 3rd. Passing tones, just 1 passing tone here in the tenor and in anticipation in the melody before we cadence on C major, C, C, E natural, and G. Okay, next phrase is going to take us back to the key of E flat major, but we're going to start in the key of F minor. We have G, B flat, E, and B flat, which is a 7 chord in first inversion. It's kind of interesting here. On the topic of buffer chords, if we look at what happens on the next beat of the harmonic rhythm, which includes E, G, G, and B flat, I think this C and this E here actually play a role in terms of the whole beat here. But if we look at the separation of these 2 beats, which are both dominant functioning chords, because it's relatively uncommon to see 5 go to 7 without anything in between them, look at what happens in the lower voices. Even though we have this B flat in the melody, we have F, A flat, and F, which is basically all of the makings of a tonic triad. So even though we don't have the entire tonic triad here, it's definitely being implied in passing, and it serves as, like I said, a buffer in between the 2 chords. So even though the analysis isn't going to make it onto the page, it's serving as a buffer to separate the 2 similarly functioning chords. So Bach is able to create like a compressed, right? The fact that it's happening over 2 beats, something that would typically happen over many beats, or maybe double the length. On the harmonic rhythm, Bach is compressing the chord progression into the span of 2 beats. So we have 7/6 going to basically 75% of a 1 chord, and then we have E, G, G, and B flat. And I think actually what's happening here is that this is a 5/7 chord, and this C and this E natural are sort of playing a role in the whole beat. You could analyze this as 7 in root position as well. I think 5/7 versus 7, they're basically the same chord. You can't spell 5/7 without 7. So I think that the C here is playing a role in the overall spelling of the chord, which could feed back into the idea here of these chords that are happening on the end of the beat as well. Instead of being, 2/6, maybe they're 2 in root position, or if maybe this 4 chord is actually a larger 2 chord in the grand scheme of things. But all in all, when chords are a third apart, typically they have the same function, or they can have the same function in most cases. There are some cases where that's not true, but like 7 and 5, for instance, you're always going to have at least one similarly functioning counterpart that's a third away from any chord you start on. So 5 is a third from 7, and vice versa. 1 is a third away from 6, 2 is a third away from 4. All these pairs, these combinations, are interchangeable functionally in terms of creating a similar narrative that Bach does in his own writing. So afterwards, we're going to see a resolution of this 2 beats of dominance. We have F, A flat, C, and A flat, which is our tonic triad in root position, and we see a passing E flat here. I think, even though this isn't a dead giveaway that we've modulated, the fact that we have E flat to D natural, then to B flat, and we don't see Bach doing the same thing we saw here with any melodic minor or any E naturals moving forward, I'm inclined to believe that this F minor is now functioning as our supertonic rather than as our tonic. So afterwards we have D, B flat, F, and F and A flat, which is 5/6/5, B flat 7 over D, and B flat and D are both chord tones, so we don't have to mark them. That takes us to E flat, B flat, E flat, and G, which is our tonic in root position. That briefly gets turned into first inversion when it skips up a third in the bass here. That takes us to A flat, C, E flat, and F, which is 2/6/5, F minor 7 over A flat, and it almost briefly turns it back into root position here, where we have F, A flat, E flat, and A flat here with this G as a little passing tone. But it's not entirely intact, so I'm not going to bother putting it on the page. We then have B flat, E flat, and F. I think that Bach's implying a 5 chord here, and again we have another 4/3 suspension over our bass. It's very common to see 4/3 suspensions over the bass, especially when the bass is a root position 5 chord. So here we have B flat, which is a chord tone, but G is an enclosure, and it's interesting because we're enclosing the 7th of the chord here, where we have B flat, A flat, D, and F, 5/7. We've seen this cadence kind of sorta in the past as well. Kind of what's happening here. Not exactly, but it's kind of what's happening. Didn't it happen elsewhere? Maybe I'm confusing it with the fact that I analyzed it earlier today. Yeah, I think I'm just remembering it from having analyzed it earlier today as well in preparation for the video. But regardless, we're going to cadence on our tonic, E flat, G, B flat, and E flat. Alright, next phrase is going to take us to the key of C minor. We have an imperfect authentic cadence here. We start off in the key of E flat, and it's kind of interesting because we have this D flat here, but it's not uncommon to see flatted sevenths in the tonic key, because the tonic can also function like 5 of 4, and that's exactly what's happening here. So with E flat, G, and B flat, I think that's exactly what's happening. We're tonicizing 4 more so than just reiterating a tonic, passing 7th in the bass. And then here's a little interesting thing that Bach does. We have C, E flat, G, and B flat. Now, even though I think that a 6 chord, or a 6/7 chord more specifically, C minor 7, is a valid analysis because you can't deny the fact that that's happening off of the harmonic rhythm, I think the big picture here is that C is a passing non-chord tone, and B flat is still functioning as the base of this chord, which just means that it's turning into second inversion in passing. That's what I think the big picture is here, because the resolution to A flat happens on the next beat, A flat, E flat, A flat, and C. So I think if you look at the C minor 7 as a passing chord, you can. I just feel like it's a little bit more incidental than anything else. But after our 4 chord, we have a passing 7th in the bass, and similar to the progressions we saw earlier, we have F, F, A flat, and C, which is F minor in root position. So again, another 4 chord going to a 2 chord, which is actually relatively uncommon to see it happen in root position. Thirds-based progressions in root position, maybe with the exception of 1 going to 6, are, in my experience, relatively uncommon in Bach's writing, so it's kind of interesting that we have this progression going on here. But in a similar fashion to what we saw here in the key of F minor, I think F is turning into our gateway into the key of C minor as well. And even though we don't have oh no, we wouldn't expect E natural because that would be an F minor. We would expect some type of B natural, which does happen on the next beat. So we have passing tones in the alto and the bass. We then have D, B natural, F, and D, which is 7, 6, 4 going to 7, very common chord progression in Bach. We have C and E flat in passing here as well, which again is sort of serving like a buffer because on the next beat we have B natural, D, G, and D, which is 5, 6. So on the page it looks like we have 7 going to 5, but again, similar to what we have going on here, we have the makings of a C minor chord in passing. So there is a buffer in between the two similarly functioning chords, and this is very much the case with dominant functioning chords. Bach will, the majority of the times when we have a case where we have 5 going to 7 or vice versa, actually it's usually 7 going to 5, there is some type of buffer in between the two chords, whether in the form of like a passing tone or an implied chord. Sometimes we get the entire chord, but most of the time it's just like an implied buffer like this where it's 2, maybe 3 voices happening in passing. So after 5, 6 we get G, B natural, G, and E flat's a passing tone. We've seen this cadential structure in the earlier cadences that we've seen in this chorale. So F is our chordal 7th as well, which is a known chord tone in this context, a little neighboring 7th here, so we'll mark it. But that's going to take us to C minor, C, C, G, and E flat. Okay, last phrase ends in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of E flat, but we have a similar start to the previous phrase that we just analyzed, E flat, D flat, this sort of downward scalar motion. Bach really just has a long sort of scalar passage here that skips from B natural to G at the end, but here we have the same makings of the beginning of the last phrase, which makes me think that we're still in the key of E flat, even though there's nothing any more inherently E flat-like about E flat 7. But my analysis is going to reflect the fact that we start the phrase in the key of E flat, because hearing E flat like this just feels like we're in the key of E flat because we've heard it before. So I think that C minor is our 6 in the key of E flat. You could also analyze this as a direct modulation if you want to. I think that that's totally valid as well. But I think that instead of our tonic, even though it feels like our tonic here, this D flat gives this chord a higher function, like I've talked about in my videos in the past, of 5/4. And basically, just like we saw in the previous phrase, we have C, G, E flat, and B flat here. And C, again, I think even though this could be a 6/7 chord, I think this is just changing the figured bass where we have B flat. And in this case, we also have D flat, which sort of mirrors the cadence that we just had, where the chordal 7th is not a chord tone, just like how it's a passing tone here, but the second of the 2 16th notes is the chordal 7th in the melody as well. So it's kind of cool that Bach is recycling an idea that he just had and infusing it with an idea that he had earlier. It's pretty cool that he's combining the ideas. There's a different word I was thinking of there, but essentially he's just combining the ideas. But afterwards we get A flat, E flat, and C, so the resolution does come just a beat after we would expect. We have B flat, we have F, we have D, and we have B flat. So we have 4 voices moving off of the harmonic rhythm, which typically means that we have a, sorry, this is not in first inversion as well, which typically means we have a chord progression happening, a subdivided chord progression that is, and it's going to take us to 5, B flat major. Then that takes us to C, E flat, and A flat, which is 4-6. We see this sometimes as sort of like a take on the deceptive progression, right? 4-6 and 6 are very similar to one another in terms of their pitch content. So going to 4-6 is just another take of that deceptive progression where we still have the 6 in the bass, but it's not a 6 chord. Afterwards, we go to B flat, E flat, and G, which is a 1-6-4 chord that's happening in passing here. That's pretty cool. And that takes us to 2-6-5, basically a straightforward 2-6-5-5-1 perfect authentic cadence, A flat, C, E flat, and F. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. G is a non-chord tone, A flat is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. We then have B flat, D, and F. It's our 5 chord, passing 7th in the tenor, and then we cadence on E flat major, E flat, G, B flat, and E flat. And that's today's analysis. So I think all in all, maybe the biggest point of contention is where we modulate back to the key of E flat here. Maybe we do visit the key of A flat for a little bit at the beginning. I personally don't hear it that way. I hear it in the key of E flat, even though there is a D flat in the key. And it's also shaped by the fact that I hear E flat major from the previous iteration of the same pattern. So there are other considerations to take, or other, I guess, factors to take into consideration when looking at what key something might be in, other than just momentary context. Like if we heard it earlier and it's like, you know, like a similar pattern that we heard earlier, I think that could also inform the key that we're in. And E flat was our destination anyway, so it was going to happen somewhere in close proximity to what was happening here. But other than that, I think the only thing that's going into my notes is the fact that we have our tonic functioning as 5 of 4, and the fact that we have a mid-phrase modulation, at least something that I've been calling a mid-phrase modulation, where we modulate to a new key at the beginning of a phrase and don't end in the key that we modulate to. So this, for example, where we start in E flat and end in B flat, that's not a mid-phrase modulation, because we only modulated once. Here we modulated twice. We went to the key of E flat, then we went to the key of F within the span of the same phrase. And that only happens once in this particular chorale. It's a relatively common thing for Bach to do, but it doesn't happen in every chorale, so it's something that I've been keeping track of. But I think that's all I want to talk about, so I'm going to cap the video off on those thoughts. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification icon, and like the video if you enjoyed the content as well. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.